Hey everybody, I'm building a PC and I thought it might be worthwhile to shoot some footage about it and just talk about some of the things I'm doing. Maybe it'll be helpful for some people who are new to PC building. I'm going to go through the parts that I purchased and sort of the rationale behind why I purchased them, and then some of the helpful tips about tools and things you'll need when you're building a PC to help sort of newcomers to PC building get started, see the process firsthand so that it's maybe not so intimidating, and help you on your journey if you want to build your own PC or even swap out some parts from a PC you have. You'll have some of the explanation of what these things are, what they do, why, what to look out for. So this isn't a super high-end build. This isn't a extreme budget build. It's kind of a middle-of-the-road build, and I'll kind of go through some of what I picked. So let's get started. First and foremost, though, you'll want to do a couple of things to prepare. You'll need some tools. Obviously, I have a screwdriver here. Mostly what you'll need is a pretty small Phillips screwdriver. So I'll have that. I just got a razor here to open packages. Got some flash drives to move any software backups, operating system of your choice, ready to go. But the most important thing, at least especially for my environment and probably yours, these components are electrostatic sensitive, so you don't want to shock any of your parts with a static shock. So I picked up one of these. I have one, I've had one for a long time. I picked up a new one. This was only $5 on Amazon, but it's a anti-static wrist strap. What you'll want to do is make sure you take this little clip and attach it to something metal, preferably unpainted metal if you can. I'm gonna look on this table here for something underneath one of the brackets. Looked like it was gonna be suitable to attach my wrist strap to. That will, and it goes onto your wrist. It's probably a good idea to, even if you want, make sure your skin isn't super dry. You may want to put a little lotion. Put their strap on. Put the other end of the strap to something grounded, preferably, like I said, nice unpainted metal is a good choice. Some people clip it to the case of the computer while they're working on it. I'd rather not send the electricity toward what I'm working on if I can help it. I'm going to do it to the table here. They also sell mats that you can work on, that you can actually plug the mat into the ground of your electric outlet. I didn't go that route because it's sort of me that's generating the electricity by scuffing my socks here on the carpet. And actually you can't see it, but I'm standing on a rubber mat that's one of these mats for a standing desk. So that'll also help while I'm kind of working and shifting, not generate more static electricity. But you'll definitely want to be careful. These parts are not cheap, and so you'll want to protect your investment. For $5. You might as well get one of these straps. It'll last you forever and will protect you from zapping your parts. Now, if you're in some kind of environment that doesn't have a lot of static electricity for some reason, this is probably still a good idea, just in case. So I'm going to start by opening this up, and then we'll go through some of my components and things. Now, this is pretty much how it works. It's this little wrist strap. It just connects to your wrist. Connect the other end. Usually these alligator clips come off, and you could attach this to, they have other kits and things if you buy, like I said, that sometimes they come even with the mat and with a connector to ground into your house ground wire. It plugs into the outlet, but just the ground cable, and then you can plug this into your mat. That's great if you want to get those. Then you have a nice grounded mat. You know it's plugged into the house ground. I don't want to trust house ground. So, I mean, I guess you could always test it with the tester, but I think for this purpose, you can just put this on your wrist and just make sure you're grounded. So I'm gonna get that put on and then we'll take the next steps. Okay, so I'm all strapped in. This is actually just connected to one of the brackets at the bottom of this table. And that should help any static electricity that my body builds up by being on this carpet here, not zap the components. So we've got that sorted. I'm gonna chuck this out of here. Okay, you'll need some other things, of course. You'll want to have power nearby for when you do power up the machine. You'll want to have keyboard, mouse, things like that. I went with this Red Dragon mechanical. I'll talk about each of these components and my experience with them when I unbox them. And obviously video cable. So you'll need cables, power, wrist strap, some tools, screwdriver. I don't think you'll need pliers. You might, if you're gonna zip tie or have some things to neaten up your cabling. We'll talk about that. And then software backups and operating system. Once you have all that, obviously you'll need your components, and we can start talking about those. Okay, now that you have all your tools, it's time to talk about selecting your components. There is a overwhelming amount of parts to choose from, so you'll want to try to decide really on budget as one of your primary drivers. And typically, I think there's kind of three categories of a computer build. You're either building for as low cost as possible. Some build for, cost be damned, and I'm going to build for the highest performance. And then there's sort of a balance between the two. You, of course, want some performance, but you don't want to overspend. And there really is a point in the price where you're getting very, very little gain for the money, the extra money that you're spending. So at some point, parts are just very cheap, but they may be a little older, and it's going to impede your upgrade ability if you want to keep the system for a long time. Then there's kind of this middle of the road bucket that's has a, price to performance kind of balance. And then at some point you're just way overspending for diminishing returns. So this build that I went with is pretty solid, middle of the road build. It's not the latest and greatest of anything. It's not, certainly not the slowest of any of the parts, and should have a little breathing room for some upgrade in the future. But you'll want to think about just how much you want to spend roughly, and then you can kind of design around that. Things that will help you decide, of course, do some research online, look at Tom's Hardware, other websites that rank and review hardware in sort of in mass. I mean, you can look at a review for any specific piece of hardware, of course, but you'll want to see some of these things, 50 different processors, for example, ranked against each other, or RAM, things like that. That will help you sort of understand where the performance is high to low, and you'll also be able to determine price high to low. There's also some nice tools online that will help you put all the parts together. I happen to use Newegg just because I had the app on my phone. Their site has a compatibility checker, so as you're putting the components together, it will throw a flag if these things aren't compatible with one another, or it will suggest things that go with what you're already building. So that's pretty helpful. You have another decision point, really. There are a few key things that are going to really drive the rest of your build. So some of these things are, you have a lot of choice, and some of these things you have to be careful of, or else they're not going to be compatible with one another. So let's start with your first main decision point is going to be if you're going to build an Intel-based platform or an AMD-based platform. Now, those have various pros and cons, and Intel makes a ton of different processors, AMD makes a ton of different processors, and between those two, depending on which you're lining up to the other one, there may be different price or performance variables between them. But if you get a ranking of all of them, commingled, then you'll be able to see high to low, what's comparable to another one, and then you can see price-wise what the difference is. So that's going to be your first main decision point. If you go with Intel, you're going to have to buy certainly a motherboard that's compatible with Intel, and the processor is going to also have certain compatibility things downstream with it. Once you're talking about how the processor and the motherboard interact, it's also going to drive what kind of memory you'll be able to support, what kind of storage speed you'll be able to support, and a lot of that kind of works together. It's not like just the processor, just the motherboard, just the RAM. They need to work together for an optimal setup machine, or in some cases it just won't work at all. For a general machine, really you just buy what you can afford, and if you have a preference, it's really Coke versus Pepsi in a lot of ways. So some of the processes are better at low electricity use, for example. Some of them have better or worse cooling. Some of them will support different speeds of memory. So you'll just have to look at what I did was just look at all of them ranked, sort of pick the one I could afford that was not the oldest, not the newest, not the most expensive. So what I decided was I went with this 12th gen Intel. This is the K, which means it has graphics built in, and I'll talk about why. Typically I go with the variation of Intel processor that does not have graphics built in, but right now graphics cards are so expensive, I'm not going to put a graphics card in this right now. So just to buy me some time, it's not a major price difference really to go with the K version, which means it does have built-in Intel graphics. F does not. That's an important distinction, right? Because if you buy one with no graphics, now you're forced to buy a separate graphics card, and they are ridiculously expensive. Okay, so decide Intel versus AMD. That's going to drive your next step, which is motherboard. Oh, and also you can see this is an i7. They make an i9, they make an i5, they make an i3. Those just have, of course, varying degrees of performance, different amounts of cores, different amounts of speed, also different amounts of electricity used and cooling needs. I like the 7. It's a step down from the 9, of course, which is the faster, but it's also less expensive. The 5 is also pretty decent, especially if you're not doing any kind of heavy-duty gaming or computational work. And the 3 is very budget-friendly, but you sacrifice some performance. Okay, so once you decide on CPU architecture, it's going to now drive your motherboard choice. Now, really, this is called the motherboard for a reason, because everything plugs into this, and this is an often overlooked component in the build. This is going to dictate how everything communicates to everything else. And so a lot of your performance actually comes out of the motherboard, because it's responsible for harmonizing all of these different components, right? Your storage, your video, your processing, your RAM. this is in charge of making all of that make sense and work together. And that'll probably explain why these things are now getting pretty expensive as well, and pretty fancy. And motherboard choice, I'll be honest, once I picked this Intel processor, I really just went with the board that had the capabilities that I want. Now, let's talk about what I needed. You'll see this has Wi-Fi built in. I didn't want to bother with a separate Wi-Fi card. You can get a motherboard that does not have Wi-Fi that would have a little cost savings, but if it's built into the board, you could always add a different one, and use that one if you need to. But I thought I would just get it built in to save on slots that are being used. Now, you can see very clearly this says Intel motherboard right on it, so we're already in a good step. So you'll have to decide what kinds of features you want from your motherboard. And that'll be things like, what kind of ports do you want on the back? For example, this has USB-C. It has a LAN port for physical Ethernet. It has Wi-Fi built in. It has audio, USBs of different speeds and generations. So you want to look at those. What kind of video output? Mouse and keyboard, obviously. And then there's a handy button here to flash the BIOS. I went with MSI because it was cheaper than Asus and some of the other ones. Like I said, I decided on the socket type and features. And you'll see here, supports 12th and 13th gen Intel processors. LGA 1700 is the actual socket. So you need to make sure that this can fit physically into this correctly. So that's how you determine those. And then really you'll have to decide what types of speed and what kind of features you want out of your motherboard. That'll help with your motherboard choice. This has DDR5 support, which is supported by this level of processor. DDR5 is the newest type of RAM currently. So that's something you want to spend some time reading through, understanding, and making sure that you get what you need ahead of time, because at some point you may want to use a particular component that isn't going to be compatible with your motherboard, and then you've got a problem. So RAM support, certainly. How much RAM, how many slots of RAM for the memory. Storage support, how many slots and how fast those are used. Some ports, for example, are only operational if you have a certain generation of processor. So processor to motherboard is going to be important. Let's talk about power for a minute. I went with 850 because at some point in the future, I want to put a reasonable graphics card into this, and I wanted to have enough power to drive some of the more modern graphics cards. These graphics cards are very, very power hungry, and if you're going to do top of the line, you're going to definitely want more than 850 watts. But that's another helpful thing about using one of these tools, especially, like I said, the Newegg tool that I used. That Newegg tool will add the recommended wattage as you're putting components into their build tool, and it will recommend minimum wattage for you. Most of the video cards, if you look at the video card, there will be a spot where it says, recommended power supply of some type of wattage. So some of the newer ones, some of the ones that have 3 fans on them, some of those things need, a 900 watt, over 1,000 watt power supply. So you want to be careful if you're planning on, in the future, adding a graphics card. Don't skimp on power supply to save on wattage. For example, if you got a 450 watt, it may be fine for running just the motherboard and processor and RAM and a couple fans, maybe. But at some point, if you try to put any kind of serious graphics card in there, it won't have enough power. Also, if you when you're talking about cooling, a lot of these fans take a lot of power, and you want to have enough to drive all that. So, decent quality power supply. This is gold certified, good warranty, which means it's going to deliver consistent, clean power. Also, I guess it's worth noting, this is fully modular. What does that mean? Fully modular means you only have to plug in the wires that you need, and it keeps things clean for you. So some of them are semi-modular, which means typically the power connector is hardwired to this. You cannot remove it. And then if it's not modular at all the cables are connected permanently. And when you're building, if you have extra cable, you have to find ways to kind of neaten those up and get them out of the way. Now, that's not just an aesthetic thing and people being cool. You don't want to have big tangles of wires blocking your airflow, because airflow is important. These parts are all heat, generating a lot of heat, and you want to kind of move that heat out of the system. So it's good to keep cables clean. This certainly was maybe not the cheapest of power supplies, but again, it's quiet, it's got a good warranty, it's going to deliver good, clean, consistent voltage, and with 850 watts will allow me to add a middle-of-the-road graphics card down the line. We have here some DDR5 memory. This is G.Skill, and DDR5, obviously, you can see. This is 32 gig in two 16 gig chips. Let's see if I can get this in here. What do some of these numbers mean? So DDR5 obviously is the generation of RAM type that it is. 5600 is the amount of bandwidth that the RAM can move. CL28 and some of these other numbers, 34, 34, 89, and the voltage. Now, CL28 means the latency. Essentially, how quickly it can move the RAM back and forth. So you want to try to find something that's low latency. 28 is reasonably low, at least right now, for DDR5. So sometimes you'll say, what's the difference between, RAM A and RAM B? Sometimes it's the generation of RAM, is it DDR4 or 5? And then not all RAM is created equal, because even though it's DDR5, for example, and it's 16 gig, the latency matters. So think about it in two ways. It's a bucket of information, how big that bucket is, and then how quickly it can exchange that bucket, or I guess dump the bucket out and fill the bucket back up. That's the latency piece. So you'll want to think about two things, both the bandwidth and how quickly it can sort of cycle all of that information. Moving on to storage really quickly. So this is a Western Digital NVMe solid state hard drive. So this one's pretty quick, 7,300 megabytes per second read. For comparison, this one's only 5,000 megabytes a second read. And read is important. Write is also important. Read-write performance, it's going to affect your boot up times. They certainly have ones that are much slower, and they have some that are faster. But if you're doing a lot of writing to the drive, you'll want to pay attention to the write speed as well. We have covered processor, motherboard, storage, talked about RAM, talked about storage, talked about everything else. A couple of other things you are going to need definitely. So this processor is just the processor. That's what it looks like. It's just a little metal chip with layers of gold and stuff inside. And you're going to need almost certainly some type of cooling. Whoa, man, I could do a whole video just on cooling, but you're going to need something to keep the processor cool, because those things run super hot. This is an LGA 1700 again. You'll see that these things are starting to come together, right? Your motherboard, your socket, all these things need to be of the same type so that they work together. I went with air cooling. My other machine, I have liquid cooling. Don't think that the main decision point there, my other machine's a gaming machine, so that's definitely going to run hotter. So I have liquid cooling there, but you'll need some type of cooler if your processor does not come with one. So you're going to have to get something there to keep your processor cool. This is interesting, and as I go through each of these, I'll kind of unbox these and talk about them a little bit. Those are all essential components. Now, so one thing that isn't here is, where do you put all this stuff? I have my case off to the side, so I'll grab that. We'll talk about my case. All right, so the last piece you're going to need, definitely as an essential, is a case to put all these things in. Now, this is a mid-tower sized case. They have smaller ones, they have larger ones, also all with different capabilities. We'll talk a little bit about why I chose this one. This one came with some cooling fans in the front and the back. It has an open window on the side, and this is a mid-size case. I've built both smaller cases and larger cases in the past. Again, if you're going either high budget or high performance, that's going to drive what you're going to need for cooling capability. So you'll want to make sure, for example, if you're building a gaming system, you're going to want to have space for some type of probably liquid cooling at the top, what kind of radiator size that will support, how big of a graphics card will fit in the case, or maybe even room for multiple graphics cards with brackets and things. So that's if you're building for high performance or for gaming. For a middle of the road build like this, I went with a mid-size case. I know it will fit my components comfortably, give me a little bit of space in there to route cables and things, and have sufficient airflow. Smaller cases, of course, are nice because they have a smaller footprint, but for me, I find things tend to get a little cramped. The airflow is typically not quite as good, and where I am planning on at some point putting a graphics card in here, I went with a mid-size case. It came with fans to save me from having to buy extra fans. I like the glass side just because I like to see the components. Okay, so here it is. This is pretty much your whole shopping cart for your basics. You're going to need a case to put all your stuff in, power to power it, a processor to do all the processing, RAM, keyboard and mouse. You probably already have one of these you can use. I did not, actually. Storage, processor cooling, and a motherboard to connect it all together. Now, I did mention you may want to have additional cooling. This case happened to come with some additional cooling. That'll just keep airflow moving, and we'll talk a bit about that when we do the build. But here are your basics. I spent, I want to think, about a couple of weeks of sort of reading and research, configuring different parts. You may want to, once you sort of decide on a part, you may want to comparison shop, because between the various sites to buy these things, the price and availability differs. So you'll want to look around. I bought my parts between Newegg and Amazon, and I just price compared between the two and bought between those two. But you can get them in lots of different places and make sure you're getting the best value. Once you have all this, we start putting it together, which will be my next video. I hope this was helpful. Talk to you soon.